Hi, everyone. Welcome today to our webinar on laying the foundation from ideation to activation. I want to thank everyone for making time to join this. Our goal today is to talk to people who are planning community development projects, and especially to really pitch this towards people in the room who might be earlier in a project and be thinking about how they prepare themselves, how they pull together and prepare themselves in terms of what's next and resources they need and team members, and be thinking about how they, chart a map towards success and measure themselves against it as they're going through it. But I think this is relevant to lots of people who might be even in the middle or later in a project as well. Before we get going, I just want to take a minute to thank the Chicago Community Trust. We put this together in part informed by many of the people who applied for a program called the Neighborhood Capital Fund, which provides really important capital dollars for community development projects. And also just want to thank everyone for doing this. If you have information that you want to share, we've asked people to put their name and organization and role in the chat. And then also ask that you add questions to the chat. And we'll probably save most of the questions to the end, but we'll be tracking those questions as we go along. And if something's relevant, we can respond to it in the moment, we will. So first, I want to talk about presenters today. My name is Kate Ansorge. I'm the Vice President at IFF of the Real Estate Solutions team. I'm joined here by Jessica Nepomiachi, who's the Managing Director of our Real Estate Solutions team. And Oluwaseyi, would you come off mute and introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. Oluwaseyi, Olaleye. I'm so glad to be able to join you all today. Excited.
Thank you. So our goals today is a little bit about IFF and our learning objectives, and then we'll be talking about planning for success for your project and look at a framework called project readiness that we find helpful for organizations and hear from Olu to a little bit about the Xchange Chicago project. I always think it's helpful to look at this information with respect to one specific project and then at the end open information up for questions. So a little bit about IFF. IFF's mission is to strengthen nonprofits and the communities they serve. We focus on providing leadership, capital, and real estate solutions. And we really believe that thriving communities are at the heart of everything. So many people today may be from nonprofits, but we also know that many people in for-profit community development, people working on shared ownership and really looking at how thriving communities are important, are all working on this collectively. And so while this is relevant to nonprofits, we find it's also relevant to a lot of for-profit community developers who are doing this work as well. Through this work, we prioritize equity. We think a lot about partnerships. People do not do this work solo. Successful projects require partnerships with government, with funders, with community to be able to navigate a lot of the roadblocks and constantly balancing the tensions between mission and money and how people are successful at these projects. And most importantly, I think we're all here because of heart. We really are passionately committed to the community and the people that are being served by these projects, but also recognize that they need to be sustainable to be successful. So IFF's role in the ecosystem is we provide real estate solutions, so consulting, we provide loans. We also act as a developer ourselves, developing low-income housing tax credits and other place-based real estate. And then we oversee some programs like programs called Stronger Nonprofits Initiative and provide research relevant to the nonprofit ecosystems. Quickly about our loan program. IFF is a nonprofit lender, and so we have a lot of information about how nonprofits access capital, including permanent loans to support gaps on capital projects, as well as bridge loans to support grants that may not that may be reimbursable or provided at the completion of projects. And then we also have several projects like the Arts and Culture Loan Fund, a flex loan program for small loans, and New Markets tax credits and affordable housing loans. Through our real estate solutions work, we really describe ourselves as a thought partner. How do you plan and execute real estate projects? That's in large part why we're here today talking about this issue. We also provide technical assistance, and for us, that means meeting people where they are, talking about their dreams, their vision, their goals for their community, understanding what that looks like from a facility project, and thinking about how that can be feasible and successful to complete it. And our expertise is across a range of nonprofit sectors from arts and culture, healthcare, early childhood education, affordable housing, and really bringing together the real estate pieces with capital, the business plan, and the operations, and helping people be successful with that. So today, our goal is to talk about why it's important to really understand your project goals with respect to your mission as an organization and what that means for your community, to look at the phases of a real estate project and understand the roadmap to success, to look at your own project within a framework of readiness, and then to hear from Olu at the end about a project story, the goal to both understand some of the project challenges that others encounter, but also to find inspiration from people who have completed projects and are seeing the fruits of their success. So let's start with planning for success. I want to start this conversation with just recognizing that we see that there is a range of facility responses in our communities, ranging from organizations who are operating out of shelter spaces that I would describe as really trying to meet the basic needs of warm, safe, and dry, up through basic and high functioning spaces, into organizations who are really thinking about beauty, nature, and art, and community inspirational spaces, and that all of these are important and relevant to nonprofits. Understanding an organization's operations, their mission, how and why they do their work is really important as an organization thinks about how they design the facility to both meet basic needs as well as to think about how they measure success and potentially move towards a community inspirational space. Community development, we feel like meets at this intersection of mission and impact. Nonprofits exist to provide a mission, to make impact in their communities, and that should really be the foundation of the facility response. We find that many community development projects have unique facility needs, and so it's really important for the organization, the project champion, putting this together to understand what specific spaces are needed in order to deliver the programs. So this could be like an early childcare space that has specific needs for a childcare classroom. It could be, for a for-profit developer, really understanding a restaurant and the specific build-out of that restaurant tenant needs. But a lot of times that we see that the existing building stock in our community does not meet these building needs up front. And so the developer champion is really thinking about how they're going to be responsive to that. And then last, but certainly not least, is that it's really important from the beginning to think about the budget and after the operations start, the business plan. What is the revenue and expense structure of the business, and how will it be successful and sustainable? So for us, thinking about how to frame this at the start of the project, I start with questions like, how does a development project meet a community need? So as a project champion putting this project together, how do you define community need and who defines it? This is a complicated and challenging question. Who is in our community? How do we define the needs? What is your role in responding to that? It starts with market studies, door to door, your clients, understanding who is the community that you're serving and how do they identify what their goals are, and how do you think about what your role is in responsive to that community. The second question that I think is related to this, but is very powerful, is just understanding how the facility project you're pursuing represents a shared priority. Sometimes we have organizations who are pursuing, really, valuable and relevant facility projects, but it can be really challenging if that is not widely embraced by others. So how has the community identified this? This sometimes looks like a quality of life plan or other community engagement to identify facility needs in a community. It's also thinking about the funders. Are funders interested in the sector, in the programming that's happening in that building? Are funders putting capital into the ecosystem that is going to support the capital development of this? This is both kind of upfront planning money at the pre-development stages, as well as the long-term capital money, and then certainly into the operations. So funding the operations if that funding is important to the revenue of the building. And then also the role of government. So sometimes the government is showing up as a funder for capital. Sometimes the government is showing up as a funder for operations. And sometimes the government is showing up in terms of policies around zoning, around the city land acquisition. And so is the project you're pursuing aligned with the goals that are of the Department of Planning or of the potential program funders that you might see for your project? So, planning for success at ideation stage, we're going to break it down into specific topics. One, we've already talked about like how do you measure impact as a project champion, and how will your project deliver impact in your community? Feasibility. How can your project drive long-term financial sustainability? So, will this facility project support you to do more services? Will it support you to be more sustainable as an organization? One way this might play out is if you lease today and you want to move into a space that you own, owning your building might give you more control over your occupancy costs. And so, this could support your long-term financial sustainability, for example. Location. Is your project a place-based initiative? So is it rooted in a specific neighborhood or geography? Or how does facility location relevant to you? So when you're picking the location of your project, really thinking about why that location is important to your story as an organization. Community, who will participate in the planning? Is this residents of that neighborhood? Is it stakeholders of your organization, funders, government, tenants potentially of your space if you're looking to have partners who are leasing space? And partners, really important is to think about who are your allies in the ecosystem already that support your project today. And if you identify gaps, who could support you along the way and who could you start working with today so that they would understand your goals? So now we're going to talk about phases of a real estate project, and I'm going to pass it off to Jessica.
Thanks, Kate. Before I start, next slide, I did want to show that we have a wonderful visual kind of showing what the phases of a facility project are. I want to kind of note that, as Kate mentioned, all of these, this phasing is not necessarily linear. So you might engage in a feasibility analysis and then find a site, and that site might not be appropriate or might not work out, and you might have to go and redefine your feasibility based on decisions and site conditions that you find. So something to keep in mind as we go through the phases, that these are not necessarily linear, and really depending on your project can need to be revisited. So when we're thinking about feasibility, as Kate mentioned, it's not necessarily thinking only about how does the space impact and support your mission. It's also about what your proposed business plan is, and also understanding how much square footage you require for your mission and your programming and your goals, but what kind of facility might fit that space required. And so are there unique facility requirements? Understanding, for example, that health centers might have unique build out that might be different than office space. At the feasibility stage, it's also really critical to identify potential sources of funding. A lot of the funding in the ecosystem is often geographically based, depending on where you are in the city or in the state. And so, if you're looking to use specific funding sources like New Markets tax credits, or, for example, City of Chicago TIF funds, you want to make sure that you understand if those funds are available as tied to your specific geography. And then also at feasibility, thinking through who is the engaged decision maker, as Kate mentioned, and that's not just community and stakeholders, but that's also within your organization and your development team. And so what are the decisions that are going to be made, and what is the criteria based off of? And so if you're looking at a facility and your goal is to enhance accessibility, and that comes out to be more costly, like how do you go back and revisit your decision making around making a facility accessible? Next slide. We're going to go to site search. And so thinking about site search, we really recommend that nonprofits, developers, and stakeholders align on the project budget. So your estimated project budget will be based on your property size and, of course, informed by construction assumptions. And that really also ties to your operating budget and ensuring that your annual operating budget is tied to facility impact and is analyzing program revenue and expenses as it relates to your facility changes. So if you were previously leasing a facility and now you're going to own a facility, there will be changes to occupancy costs, for example, to, maintenance and contracts for snow removal. How are you building that into your budget to generate revenue to cover those new occupancy costs? And then, as I mentioned earlier, site search uh, can often be dependent on capital sources. So identifying early on if there's funding that's tied to a specific geography is really helpful. Thinking about site search, it's also important to be aligned on not just the search criteria, but the space needs and what kind of building will support your space needs. And so there's important property criteria that you might need to consider in terms of, is your program and mission and development need to be place-based versus, in a more broader part of a geography? Do you need to be close to parking or do you need to have parking in your facility, or are your uh, staff and clients and folks that access your building relying on public transit? And is that something to consider when you're engaging in site search? Next slide. Site search and all of these things, I just kind of want to note that there's no actual right or wrong time frame, right? And so you might spend more than 3 to 6 months finding a site, because this really depends on what's out in the market and your space needs. And so one of the things that we recommend is really working with a broker early on and considering off-market properties, developing a short list of properties, and then visiting and assessing those property conditions to understand if it's a viable option for your programming, as well as how does that tie to your budget. And budget is also inclusive of not just, the construction costs, but the acquisition costs. And as we know, acquisition costs can also vary widely depending on where your facility might be located or your development project might be located in the city. You may need to revisit site search. And again, all of this is about the iterative nature of development and what you need to be revisiting as you get new assumptions about your budget, your stakeholders, your funding in the ecosystem. In terms of real estate readiness for site search, it's important to engage an attorney early to understand your path to site control. So understanding, lease negotiations and your purchase and sale contract, and then really early on understanding what are the impacts to the land. So are there environmental conditions that you need to clean up, and how do you account for that in your budget? And most importantly, is zoning. So making sure early on that you're working with an attorney and an architect to confirm that your proposed use is compliant with the zoning code. It would be really risky to buy a property and then, realize later that you're not able to operate it as you would like because your building does not comply with zoning. Going into pre-development, this is really not a very inclusive slide. For those who have done this work before, you'll see that oftentimes there's much more involved, but the big picture is really, pre-development phase can last anywhere from a year to 5 years, depending on, how your project and how, where your project is located. Do you have site control? Securing your financing, working with public partners to secure your financing, selecting your development team, engaging in architectural drawings, engaging in a contractor for cost estimates, understanding the timeline for the bid process, especially when you're working with public sources, understanding all of the compliance that needs to go into public bidding. And then also, as I mentioned, site due diligence and getting environmental approval from funders and the state of Illinois or city of Chicago if required. Pre-development ends with getting your permits and starting construction. With construction, really just kind of laying out here that the cost and duration will really depend on the size of the space and the scope of renovation. And that's something that, we really encourage early on during feasibility to get aligned on. So, are you raising a certain amount of money to make a certain kind of facility, or are you, going to draw the facility that you are dreaming of, and then you will raise the money later? And we'll go into that a bit later around capital and real estate readiness. And so understanding the condition of your building and what that will require in terms of renovation is really important early on because that can really drive your budget. During construction, IFF always recommends that you work with an owner's representative, project manager to attend weekly architect meetings to be able to track and approve your budget and contingency and change orders. And then, of course, work with your general contractor to process payment applications on time. Turnover and occupancy, this does look simple, but oftentimes it can take a while for anyone that's worked with the city of Chicago, getting your inspections aligned, getting your certificate of occupancy aligned, and making sure that on day one that your facility opens, you have everything that you need to start your operations. Gonna talk about IFF's real estate readiness framework. And so when we think about engaging in a facility project, it's really critical for developers and nonprofits to assess where you are in terms of organizational readiness, real estate readiness, and capital readiness to engage in a facility project. When we think about organizational readiness in the context of community development, it's really simply put your ability to achieve your project goal. And that's really dependent on resources, schedule, capacity, skills, gaps, inclusive of gaps on your staff that you might need to fill. So if you're having a special use discussion or a zoning change, ensuring that you have folks that are engaging community stakeholders above and beyond aldermanic engagement to ensure that you're engaging in a zoning change that is supported by the community. If you are expanding your facility, expanding your programs, ensuring that you have the financial and administrative infrastructure to really understand your revenue and expenses as it relates to this. And of course, partnerships. So who do you have in your orbit that can support your project when there's challenges and also opportunities? Thinking about organizational readiness is both, the staffing that you have day to day, and who's leading the development project, their capacity and experience, as well as the project team. And so, most folks don't do this alone, as Kate mentioned. Doing development takes a big team based on a variety of expertise. And so early on, assessing what expertise you have on your team and also the expertise of your board. Do they have real estate experience, funding experience? Are they supportive of understanding the changes to the sustainable business model and having their input early and often can really ensure that the feasibility stage gets to a place where everyone is on board and understands what gaps you might have to fill to complete a facility project. I'm not going to go too much on this slide, but as you can see, building a team also builds your capacity. So when you are engaging in a development project, it's not just you, the owner, you have architects, you have general contractors, you have environmental consultants, you have furniture, fixture, and equipment vendors. You need to think about, what kind of energy efficiency you want to bring to your building, and you are not doing it alone. And so it's important to identify what your team needs to be reflective of your specific project, and of course, understanding what the budget is as tied to these consultants that are needed to complete a facility project. Real estate readiness in the context of community development is simply put, understanding your site. Is there a site? Is it owned? Do you understand the site conditions and the implications of those site conditions? If there's environmental issues, are you investing in investigation to understand what you need to do to clean it up, to include that in your budget? Is there a zoning change required? From a design perspective, are you procuring an architect? And what is your architect procurement process? When you're thinking about real estate readiness, it's important also to think about where your schedule is and what design milestones you need to meet to complete your facility project. And so a lot of folks we see, engage in schematic design, preliminary design, do a cost estimate, and then might wait to do some fundraising until they get the cost estimate to better understand what gaps there are in the budget. With construction, again, is there a cost estimate? Do you understand the timeline to get to permit? Do you understand the timeline to get to contract with your general contractor? And then with permit. So there's a lot of different permits in the city of Chicago, depending on your project, ensuring that you understand what permits are needed at what time and who in the city you can speak to ensure that you are working in compliance with what's needed. Capital readiness is really the readiness for you to seek capital funding for a facility project. And so, in addition to program impact, funders are really looking at your organizational readiness, your real estate readiness, and your financial sustainability of operations. So, how are you going to ensure that there's enough revenue to cover your expenses for long-term viability? Understanding the project narrative is a really important part of capital readiness because it shows funders that you're thinking about risk and shows funders that you're thinking about the constraints that you might have. So, for example, is there a project gap that you need a funder to fill? Or is there a timing of capital needs? So, it's great when you get a grant for $5 million from the city of Chicago, but really, do you have the funding for pre-development needed to get to that permit and start construction? And so when we think about capital readiness, it's not just about what you know about your project, but it's also, as Kate mentioned, what you know about the ecosystem. And so, working early and often with funders to understand, what their priorities are as it relates to your project is a really great way to understand capital readiness. Also, capital readiness relates to the amount. So simply put, what is your project cost and how much has been raised? And then the timing of funding. As I mentioned, pre-development funding is the cash on hand you need to pay for your permit, to pay for your architect, to pay for your construction manager, to pay for your survey. I have here that 6 to 12 months may be what a pre-development timeline looks like, but you'll hear from others and that oftentimes pre-development starts and stops depending on where you are on the readiness spectrum. And so it's something to consider that you might need to pause on design to continue fundraising, to continue getting to your next design milestone. And then for construction. So a lot of public funding sources that we have in the ecosystem are actually reimbursable. City of Chicago, State of Illinois, legislative earmarks, federal earmarks. And so, does your project need a bridge loan? Because grants will come in at completion, or will you be engaging in a capital campaign to raise that funding ahead of time to be able to pay your general contractor while you wait and submit for reimbursement for public sources? I'm going to pass it back to Kate.
Thank you, Jessica. So I wanted to just share, one of the things that we came up with the readiness framework is that we found that a lot of people were like, oh, that project's ready or that project's not ready. And it was just really lacked specificity around what was going on in the project. And so we felt like it was helpful to break things out and to be thinking about the capacity of an organization in terms of their staff and board and their resources, and then think about the real estate and like, do you own the property? How far along in design are you? Do you have cost estimates from a contractor into capital of really thinking about not just like if your project's 10 million, you have 2 million raised, but thinking about like, do you have money today to keep paying your architect to keep going? And if you don't, that's going to make it hard to do a capital campaign because showing that you're making real estate progress can be really important to some funders who want to come in late in the game and fill in a gap at the very end versus other funders who might be coming in early. And so all of that, I think it's really helpful for you as a project champion to understand kind of where you are with each of those pieces as you're talking to a board member who's concerned about progress or not progress, or if you're talking to a funder about this opportunity and what it means for your organization. I think one of the biggest challenges for this work after I've been doing it for as long as I have is seeing how much organizations have to zigzag back and forth between pushing the real estate to wearing the hat of a fundraiser to trying to balance their staff resources when there's other competing priorities right now, which are pulling staff into other really important work. And so trying to triangulate all of that is hard, and having more resources to understand a framework, I think, can be helpful as you try and figure out how to prioritize things. We also find that this readiness framework helps with decision making. And so I wanted to just do like a little case study of like, well, when and how to use readiness to think about decision making on your project. So today we're going to focus on a project budget as a tool for you making decisions. First, I want to talk about like, well, why is a project budget important? I think most people think of it as a math exercise. So it's, A plus B equals C, and you hope that you have enough money to pay for everything that you're going to have to pay for at the end of it. I would propose thinking about the project budget much more expansively. For us, a budget is a feasibility tool. You put it together at the beginning of a project to try and get collective agreement on what you're doing. How much is it going to cost? Does our organization have funding to do this? Second, it's a decision-making tool. As you're moving through and you learn that an architect's proposal is going to cost, X amount of dollars, is that match what you originally expected? If not, why? What does it tell you that this proposal is significantly different than your original estimates? Is that something you want to say yes to, or do you want to get additional proposals and talk to other people and revisit the assumptions that you originally put together? A budget is a really important storytelling tool. Funders are interested in putting capital dollars and operating dollars into projects, but they want evidence that you've done work to verify that this is the right amount of money that you need for the project. A lot of times we see people ask for funding and later there's cost escalation. You're going back to a funder and you're having to ask for more money. Funder's going to say, well, why did the project cost change so much? There are lots of good reasons why project budgets go up, but there's other times where it was, kind of mismanagement and chaos. And so having a narrative that explains why the, inflation, why tariffs, why scope changed, why other things might have changed your budget is really important to being able to navigate a challenging conversation with a funder about the opportunity to invest in your project. Budgets are really important to track how much you've spent and how much remains. And so this gets into this timing of money, which is if you've paid $500,000 for project expenses, what do you have to pay in the next 6 months, and do you have that much money? So you're often fundraising for a big number, like a $10 million project budget, but you're also fundraising for the expenses that you need to pay in the next 6 to 12 months. And so being able to track both of those in a budget is important to the success of your project. And the last is mitigating risk. We'll talk a little bit more about risk, but one of the main ways that we mitigate risk is that we want to plan comprehensively. Sometimes people come to me and they say, my project costs $2 million. And I'll say, what's included in that? They're only looking at construction. They haven't included things like furniture or a security system that they're going to need for their project, or a survey or an appraisal that they need for a financing expense. And so one, I think in risk is thinking about all of the costs that might come up in a project. And the other is that there are going to be things that you can't plan for. We call those usually unforeseen conditions, and you keep a contingency. And so we always recommend that there's some money for things that you don't know are going to happen, because they always happen in real estate projects. And it doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It's just the nature of the business. So when we talk about a budget, we put together usually 3 different categories. The first is the hard costs. This is going to include mostly your construction costs for the project budget. The next are soft costs. Soft costs are really anything that's not construction related cost. And so that includes your architect, your building permit guy go in that category, your attorney. This is where you would see like project management or owner's representative services. Financing fees are important to plan for if you think you might need a permanent loan to fill a gap, or if you need a bridge loan, thinking about this grant, I'm pursuing a grant from the city for $3 million. I'm going to have to bridge that with a loan. And so what would be the cost of the expense of interest on that? And furniture, fixtures, and equipment. So this is, low voltage phone lines, computer lines, furniture, security systems, could be a playground if you have a program that you need to invest in the equipment like that. And the last is we usually recommend setting this contingency at 10% of all of your costs, so both your hard costs and your soft costs, so that you're prepared for unforeseen conditions. Sources, we're going to do a deep dive today into sources. We've had other conversations where we've really looked with a lot of attention at the different sources of capital for projects. Today, I just want to touch on, we see three main sources. We see public funding that's coming from local, state, and federal level. So this is like City of Chicago money through the community development grants. Sometimes we see money through Cook County or the state of Illinois through the DCEO program. Occasionally, we have legislative earmarks through a state representative and potentially federal funding, federal earmarks as well. Private money, this is largely going to be philanthropic money. It could be your owner, fundraising that you're doing through a capital campaign, potentially other utility incentives and other types of corporate support. And then the last is debt. And so, if a loan would allow you to do a project sooner than later, I think this is really important to think about, like cash flow of your organization, what this facility project will do for your operations, because it became very strategic to say, rather than wait 3 more years to fundraise another $3 million, I could take out debt today that would allow me to move in that project more quickly. And if you are pursuing a loan, really thinking about, the terms, your organization's financing existing today and relationships that you might have with traditional banks, and having conversations earlier with people about what that would look like. So rather than waiting to a situation where you're like, oh no, I need to go and do this in the next 30 days, really thinking proactively about who could have a partner relationship with you and who could have a conversation to understand your borrowing capacity and what it would mean for this project. Operating budget is really critical to the success of a project. Sometimes I talk to people who are really focused on the real estate and getting the site and getting the building. And when I ask questions about the revenue and expense structure, I don't get a lot of details. I think it really supports your success of your project to have a clear information around what programming is going to go in that building, how that programming is funded today, whether you're ramping this programming up or whether you're actually adding a new program. So sometimes people are like, I'm going to start running a childcare center because I think it's really important to my community, but I've never run a childcare center before and I don't know anything about the revenue and expense model. And so this would highlight really a capacity gap on your organization. And so how can you find partners or good information around how you're going to be successful in putting that revenue and expense together? And occupancy costs, and is really thinking about what occupancy costs might change on your project. So as I said, this is thinking about decision making. So how does the budget show up in terms of decision making? Well, we often see tension between the scope and the budget, right? Do you say yes to things that you think are important for your program and your building, but they're going to cost more money? Or do you say no and say, I've got to pull back. I haven't raised as much money as I had hoped. It's important for me to cut this. I think that really starting with that, what we talked about at the beginning, your mission as an organization, how you make impact is incredibly important to this conversation, because really that's why you're doing this. And you have to go back to your reason why. If a scope cut is going to really damage your ability to be successful as an organization, in fact, it might actually damage your sustainability as a business, then that's a really important thing to review and maybe to say, you know what, I'd rather keep fundraising and keep this scope in. An example I've given before is I worked with a childcare organization that identified that they wanted to do 10 childcare classrooms. The costs were too high. They had about a gap of $750,000 on a $7 million project. This is a big gap on a project. And we put on the table, what if we cut 2 classrooms? That's what it would cost for us to be able to get the project back into a balanced budget. And I talked with the organization's leader. They felt confident a few things. One, that funders would question them doing this if they pulled back on delivering the childcare classrooms. And second, that it wouldn't actually pencil out, that those 2 extra classrooms were so important to their business model that they needed to get the cash flow from those rooms in order to be successful as an organization. When we had that conversation, we were able to go back to the drawing board and we just, quickly said, we can't cut the classrooms. We've got to find a way to balance budget, but not at the cost of those classrooms. It helped the whole team really collectively, make a decision quickly and keep moving with the project in a way that I think was really healthy. Even though it was a hard situation to be in, I think the team was all aligned on what their goals were as a project. And so those really early conversations around your mission and impact are just so important. They keep coming back up in your project as you keep moving forward with it. The other thing is just to name, this is very iterative. And so what does that mean? It means that you start with a vision. You go out, you talk to your architect, you talk to your contractor, you get information about how much this costs. You go to your funders, you ask for money. You get some money, you get some no's. You go back to the drawing board with the architect and contractor and revisit what that program is. And as you're going through that, your business plan might also be changing. So there's things going on at the national level right now that are changing how people are operating their businesses and maybe causing people to be more risk averse or to see opportunities that they hadn't previously pursued and say, you know what, I need to pivot my business model in the middle of this real estate project. All of this is hard and stressful, but I think it helps to go into the project saying this is what you should expect in the project and be prepared for it and have a team who can recognize that you're going to have to zig and zag. And that's part of the nature. And it doesn't mean, again, that you're doing it wrong, that it's really part of the roadmap of these projects to be able to navigate it. And the last thing I'm going to end before we bring in Olu to share with us his story is to talk about risk. So, risk is part of all of these projects. I think anyone who's trying to avoid risk altogether just shouldn't be in the real estate game doing development. And so, if you are going to know that risk is part of your project, then how do you manage it and how do you think about how you protect your organization to make decisions around it? So, risk for me is the difference between what you expected to happen and what actually happened. How do you measure? How do you prepare for uncertainty about our future in a time where we have a lot of uncertainty? And so examples of types of risk are like, how long will this take? Will I get the money? What is the real estate market going to look like? Will I be able to find a building? Unforeseen conditions that I didn't expect inside my building when I open the walls. Will a tenant sign a lease? Will they show up and pay? And so recognize that it's unavoidable. Then you can think about like, well, what can you do as an organization to protect yourself? So one, really important to identify project assumptions so that you can get them on paper and then say, what did I think was going to happen? Oh, something really different happened. Let's go back to what that assumption was. What was that assumption based on? So did I throw in the kitchen sink in terms of programming and my building doubled in size? Is that something that I'm in control of or not? The decision-making criteria. How do we decide to do this project? How do we go back to those criteria when new information comes up to reuse that criteria again to say, what is it we're doing here and how do we make a hard decision? And then looking at alternatives, so always feeling like you have another choice. You may not like that other choice, but you should put it on the table. Sometimes I find that IFS role in the real estate consulting space is to help see what other choices you have so that organizations can feel good about making that hard choice. They may not like the choice that they made, but they can see that the other choices are worse. And so that helped them feel good about the hard choice that they were making. Having a good team is really important with risk. The more information you know, the better prepared you can be, and the more you can spend time thinking about alternatives with that development team expertise to support you to be successful. And then last is really thinking about contracts, that there's lots of legal ways, having a good attorney on your project, having board members who have experience in this would be really helpful to protect you so that if something difficult comes up, that you know legally and contractually you're protected in those situations. Capital readiness, we think of risk as just understanding kind of your timing of money. So do you have money today to pay for these expenses? What do you think is going to happen in terms of when you're going to have to pay for expenses? Sometimes this means phasing a project. So you might want to do a $10 million project, but there's a way to break it into chunks. And so you say, right now, I'm going to fundraise $3 million for the next 2 years. I'm going to fundraise $2 million for the 2 years after that. And I'm going to fund the rest of it as a phase three. So from a real estate perspective, you often need to work with your architect and your contractor to look at the existing conditions of a property and say what's feasible. Sometimes they'll say, you know what, your building needs a gut rehab and you got to do 80% of your project costs up front because you've got to fix the roof and the core and shell and all of your HVAC systems. So being able to have those kinds of conversations with your development team are helpful because you have to then talk with the capital side to say, like, is this money going to show up at the right time that I need it from the real estate perspective? And then just having really transparent conversations with your funders about your capital needs. Obviously, this means you having clear goals about your mission, understanding your business model, but also building a space of trust with them where you can say, like, here's what I know about the project, here's what I don't know. How can you be a partner with me in sharing some of the risk in the situation? All right. At this point, I want to invite Olu in. We wanted to focus on a story because I think seeing real estate projects through the eyes of someone who has led these projects is really important. And so with that, Olu, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you so much, IFF team. Before I start, I just definitely want to underscore. Also, I have had a chance to like change the PowerPoint since we last spoke, but just want to just update that. Um, I just want to first underscore that everything that the IFF team has shared is very much true, from the pre-development aspects to serving as owner's rep and fundraising, capital stack, corporate governance. All of that are just like super important. Um, if possible, I'm actually going to share my screen and if just go from there. Okay, cool. The request has just been sent. But basically, perfect. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, cool. I'm gonna have to like move to the slide. It's a long slide. Um, but like I was saying, everything that was shared by the IFF team was really like true and is reflective in our journey. Before I actually share Xchange, I want to like first caveat that Xchange is actually a organization founded by three other organizations that actually came together. They included P33, which was founded by Penny Pritzker to make Chicago a tech economy, SDI Presence, which actually serves as our employer of records in all of this, as well as the Comer Education Science Foundation. This is a not-for-profit that's actually has had 30 plus years in the Greater Grand Crossing neighborhood. So though we have not done like direct large scale projects such as this, the Comer campus actually, we have done various like land and real estate projects. This includes a farm, a 1 acre farm, clean and green. This includes a 80,000 square feet youth center. This also includes working with the Noble Network to help launch a Noble middle school and high school. So for us, we've had history and we've been kind of in a space of like real estate, land management, but Exchange Chicago was something that was like very unique for us. And it very much is a learning process. I just want to first highlight that for Exchange, we're actually based in the Greater and Crossing neighborhood. So building on the legacy of like the years of like real estate investment we've done in the neighborhood. In terms of like the acquisition, we bought the building, but I will caveat that all of this was actually really inspired by the Chicago Prize, and I definitely do want to emphasize that, especially as it comes to like pre-development and doing the necessary work to like basically get your project launched. In terms of like revenue, as you can see, we basically have a CAM, retail to tenant. We service owner's rep. In terms of capital stack, we had to get very creative in basically making this possible. This included new market tax credit. There was City of Chicago CDF 5 million that we've received. Various private debt that we took on from Old National Bank, Northern Trust. Chicago Community Trust was also very much involved. So there was a lot that was actually done in the early stages just to make sure success is like, achieved. The total project was about $20 million, right? And that number did increase throughout the stages. But in terms like the construction timeline, I want to emphasize that it basically went from May 24th to November 25th. I'm sorry, May 2024 to November 2025. That is seems like a year in terms of like getting the construction. But I want to also really like emphasize that in terms of like the core and shell, the work we actually were doing beyond Exchange was lasted about, I want to say, 3 years. Starting, want to say February 2020, during the pandemic a bit with the Chicago Prize. And the Chicago Prize really, really for us like was that time, that 2 year actualization. So as I mentioned earlier, the Comer has experience in terms of like land real estate, but we've never done anything like this before, right? But as part of like that high school, so that high school has actually been in operation for 15 years. We have been tracking data, right? And like any great organizations, we actually look at the data to see what it is pointing to us, like, the direction we should be going towards. And the high school showed that we had many young people who were the first in their families to graduate. go to college and graduate. And when they would come back to Chicago, if they come back to Chicago, they were mostly like in underserved, underemployed roles. So for us, we were always thinking about that. And of course, the pandemic happened, and the virtual life, right, really like inspired the idea of like, tech and workforce development. And the reason why I want to emphasize that is because these work actually informed a lot of like, our actions, our steps are going forward. So just like I know I have mindful of time, but just like quickly highlight in terms of some of like the key metrics of success for Exchange, I definitely would say it was the Chicago Prize. Even though we did not win the Chicago Prize, it was and I stated February 2020 just because like that's when we were invited to apply. But Chicago Prize just really served as like an actualization of like, okay, think about your data and what you're gonna do with this data. And in fact, even though we did not win the Chicago Prize, it was actually a 300 page about submission we had to turn in. And those 300 pages submission really had us thinking about the ins and out of like how we were gonna make this idea work. And I'll even share like the idea that we pitched for the Chicago Prize is very much far different from the idea we're pursuing today, right? But we definitely thought about like community investments, like who are our community stakeholders. We thought about like some of the very same questions the IFF team had proposed to us in terms like land management. And for us, we were originally going to do like a new construction, right? However, not winning the Chicago Prize actually was like serendipity, because we were actually able to buy the building which we bought was actually formerly Food and Paper, which is one of our former our community stakeholders, and they were actually at the retirement age, and during the time they actually sold us the building for I want to believe like north of $1 million. So it was just serendipity. The site was actually much closer, less cheaper, and because we were actually doing a core and shell renovation instead of a rebuild, actually brought the GMP down a bit to $20 million. And I also say just because we've had histories of working doing various projects. Comer was able to leverage like relationships that we've had from architects who have been in the neighborhood, general contractors who we have worked with and have like gained that level of trust. So definitely want to emphasize like relationship building and collaboration really matter. Even for us, even though again, we've done an 80,000 square foot youth center, 2 acre clean and green farm, and a few other projects. We still had to like basically leverage the background and work of CNI, Chicago Neighborhood Initiative, because again, they are an institution who knows this very much. They have sponsored and helped many projects throughout Chicago. And for us, we were very committed in, making sure we wanted to get to that milestone. So we found the best person who we could, which was CNI in this case. Um, the two other things I also want to emphasize quickly is human capital. One thing that we always currently say in our internal team is I'd rather be in the wrong business with the right people than be in the right business with the wrong people. So I'll let that sit for you. Just because for us, even though we spent 2 years, and I'll even argue like longer because we've been tracking data from our young people in high school, right? We felt that we had an idea, we know what was going to happen. However, like so much happens and shift that being and having the right partner and stakeholders truly matters. And the last thing I would emphasize is relentlessly chase impact, especially like with unit economics. During the first aspect of, starting things, especially like philanthropy, they're, always willing to give you grace. But as a project matures and as a project, progresses, there are like expectations. So being able to understand like, grace and favor do run out, but being able to deliver on value and impact first will take you further. So I just want to just emphasize that. Um, I'm going to use these next few slides to actually talk about the exchange model because us understanding that model is how we basically determine what space and all the like real estate, construction, and land things that all go into that. So as I mentioned, Exchange is actually founded by three organizations. So we are apprenticeship IT tech center, and for us, during COVID, the world was changing. and we saw the work from home was actually a thing. As a workforce development, we analyzed, our current ecosystem and found that employers were actually facing some internal resistance in terms of like, hiring, just because for them it was such a high lift, right? So the current model is that employer is basically creating the internal programs and resources to train people. The second model is basically leveraging third-party suppliers, right? So just outsourcing, working staff agency, etc. And for us, where Exchange kind of like lives and operate is that we have this huge bet. So outside of the Chicago Prize, we also worked with BCG to create a study. And the study basically analyzed that when you look at Chicago Corporate Coalition, about $16 billion is budgeted in their IT spent, and less than 10% of that actually stays in Chicago, let alone the US. So for us, how do we rethink about reshoring IT dollars that have to be spent and bringing them specifically to the South and West Side, right? So really emphasizing that geography place element. So for us, just to kind of fast forward, we basically did a analysis, determined it was 16 billion. If we can capture 2% of that, that is basically going to create about, 2,000 jobs annually. So working backwards through a back of envelope analysis, we understood that for us to create this place-based investment that's going to create economic impact, it's going to require a lot, right? Chicago corporations leaning in, sourcing locally, training locally. But for us, we have been able to achieve, I'll say, a lot. Now I'm looking at this slide. I realize that the numbers are not up to date. But in terms of like the last 18 months, we have trained 67 individuals. We have placed 60 people into full-time IT, family sustaining wages, and have brought in more than $5 million in W-2s to the South and West Side. So for us, get into this required a lot, right? So there's like the high analysis of like this is what's feasible, but when you actually start getting to like the T's, the I's, like the grassroots, it actually becomes a lot. So for us, we were really excited about like our model and what was feasible. And even before we actually had the 28,000 square I feet 28,000 square feet IT tech center that we built, we actually rented a temporary space that served as the home base for our first few cohorts, right? So we were paying about $5,000 a month in rent to a local partner. And we actually were aware of the space because during the Chicago Prize, we were actually surveying various community assets that we could leverage. So that was something that we recognized that we could leverage. So for about 2 years while the core and shell was being built, we actually leveraged that temporary space to be our home base. And it wasn't until November of 2025 that we actually had our first grand opening. And in fact, we have one more grand opening. We have a commercial kitchen food operator that we had included as part of like our construction. But of course, things take phases, especially like when it comes to fundraising. So I just want to really emphasize that our strategy really focus on a place-based assessment, right? How do we leverage um, dollars that are spent by IT companies, Chicago IT companies, and how do we bring them to make family sustaining wages and community? So for us, working backwards, that's like a lot, right? It's going from like 10,000 feet to like 1,000. So for us, emphasis on partners, right? Knowing who's in the landscape, who's already doing what. So for us, we actually had an interview about, I want to say, roughly 20 plus partners. We collected information. And for us, it was very much an iterative feedback and discussion, right? And again, we Exchange is a triage of three different organizations: Comer, SDI, P33, each with their own competing interest. But at the end of the day, we have to be aligned in terms of like value. So I'm just this is the last few slides, but just want to quickly emphasize. So Exchange, we do a lot, right? We serve as a connection for our local residents for skills, careers, and just like local flexibility. In terms like the pre-development stage, it was super important, right? In terms of like understanding like the development process, what properties we needed, right? So we actually own a field house that we were actually going to that was going to be the site of our new construction. However, because we didn't win the Chicago Prize, we're actually able to find a closer building. There was actually less of a capital investment. We of course had to needed a bridge loan. In fact, this is like one caveat that we were just so privileged enough to have. We have a another branch of the Comer Foundation, which we're able to borrow from. So we had a bridge loan of $1 million. I understand, like, that's a merit that we have, and in your case, it may be different, but that bridge loan was like, very much important in basically making sure we could do the environmental phase ones and phase two, the necessary pre-check that the city requires that they later reimbursed you for, right? Even for us, we also went through an automatic transition, right? When we were starting the goal, we actually had former Alderman Leslie Harrison, who is like based here. She was an advocate for us in City Hall. However, while the project was being, teed up, she retired. So there was a transition within the alderman while we were still, in this phase. And for us, we had to like, get his investment, right? Like, get him to like buy in and definitely see that this is like worth living, right? And for us, our theory of engagement, right? It's constantly changing, constantly evolving. That $20 million was not 10, $20 million. At one point, it was 10, it was 15, right? So understanding that the GMP may change, right? And even for us, our timing was just very like, interesting. So during our time in Biden administration had injected a lot of capital into like the U.S. communities and cities, which we're able to leverage. During the start of the Trump administration, a lot of those were recessed and pulled back. Even in terms like the tariffs, right? Who'd have thought like ordering glass and furnitures and fixtures will like take longer, but those types of like unforeseen circumstances definitely did impact, the budget, the timeline. So being able to think of like, or like, think of other alternatives is definitely super important. I want to highlight that the construction duration was 10 months, very quick, and especially in the city of Chicago where a lot of projects like don't necessarily always get to completion. But I want to really emphasize like those 10 months really are like 15 years, right? They are based and rooted in data that we have been tracking from our young people to data to be captured during the COVID pandemic, to also to what we were hearing in the Chicago coalition community. So a lot of this was like, just how do we come together to leverage human capital, local assets, and just like make it work. So it has been, interesting 4 years, but super excited for what we have been able to achieve and what is to come.
Thank you so much. I love hearing your story, and I think it's really aligned with some of the conversations we had earlier. So before I open it up for questions, I did want to tell people that we are hosting a panel on February 4th with representatives from Latinos Progresando, from EG Wood, and from Duo Development. And we'll be talking a lot about some of the themes that we talked about today. So if today was interesting to you, please register and come back on February 4th. And then I wanted to open it up. I didn't see any questions coming in the chat. There was one question from someone about examples of this work in the South suburbs in the education sector. And I just wanted to say to everyone, kind of this work we feel like is really supportive of a wide range of nonprofit sectors. So we work from healthcare to homeless shelters to food pantries to for-profit community development. And the questions today are supportive, I think, of people in any of those sectors. But if anyone wants to speak with us more about a specific geography, we work across the Midwest in several major cities, and we work across a range of different sectors. So would love to connect more if you have personal questions. Other people, if you want to come off mute and share a question for the group. Well, I'll stay here for a few more minutes. I also saw a question about sharing out the recording and the slides, and we do intend to do that. So if you're looking to have follow up to this meeting, we'll be able to share that. Yes, if you're looking for a link to the February 4th, please check the chat and you'll be able to find the link. All right, I'll let everyone go. Thank you so much for taking an hour of your day to join us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for hosting IFF and the
Yes,
Chicago
thank you,
Community
Olu.
Trust. This
Thank
was
you
like an
so
awesome
much.
experience.
Thanks, Olu. Bye.
Thank you.